Hello everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how I painted this Christmas robin. So if you saw the video that I uploaded here to YouTube at the weekend, you'll know that my Patreon members asked me to make a Christmas themed tutorial. So obviously I then wanted to go ahead and make one for my pastel tier and my acrylic tier. So for the acrylic tier, I decided to paint this robin. Now when I think of Christmas, it's one of the first things that springs to mind. They are adorable little birds, and for something like this it worked really well on this round MDF disc. Now this was the first time that I'd used this surface, and I did have to prepare it to make sure that it was suitable for the paints to go on, but I was really happy with the end result. Now to do my background, I did use my airbrush. As you can see, I created like a blue vignette effect, and I'm now using this stencil over the top and just adding in some of this snow. Now the airbrush does create a very unique effect. It's very soft but can also work well for really fine details. Now I go in depth with this section throughout the whole of this tutorial on my Patreon version, but for this I'm holding the airbrush fairly close to the surface and obviously quite close to the stencil. The reason for that is I didn't want the paint to go all over the stencil, because for me the snow on this stencil, although the stencil is lovely, I think the snow is far too grouped together for what I wanted to capture in my painting. I was only trying to actually paint in one or two of these snowflakes at one time, so I needed to be a little bit more careful and more precise, so therefore I needed to hold the airbrush slightly closer to my surface to make sure that the paint didn't cover numerous parts of this stencil. Now obviously that is going to come down to personal preference and how much of that snow that you want to include, but the stencils, and this stencil in particular, and how random the snowflakes looked, I really liked. I didn't want all of the snowflakes to be circular, I did want them to have that variation. So when it came to painting the bird, I wasn't sure how this surface was going to cope with the acrylics. I like using the Liquitex Basics. That is my paint of choice because I like working in glazes, and a lot of the colours in that brand are quite transparent. But regardless of the subject or the surface that I'm working on, I like to map in the eye first, and when I'm working on the bird, especially when I'm working on a slightly smaller scale like this, I'll usually then work on the beak. Now even though this is a very small area, you'll see that I'm paying really close attention to my highlights and my shadows. I speak about this in so many of my tutorials here on YouTube and on Patreon. Obviously the Patreon versions I go into significant depth for this. But you can have the colour spot on, but if you don't have the contrast right, the painting is going to be flat. So we want to make sure that we've got our shadows as dark as they need to be and our highlights as bright as they needed to be. Now for this, my main aim is obviously I wanted to get that red chest of theirs completely vibrant, that really nice orange saturated colour. So in order to hide the colour of the background, because Liquitex Basics are very transparent, I put down a layer of the white first, and then that's going to allow me to block out some of that blue background and then apply my vibrant oranges and yellows on top. I then carry on just mapping in the rest of the bird. Now normally I like to work in small areas. I'll get an area about 80% complete and then I'll move on to the next. But because this was slightly smaller, this was on a 6-inch round panel here, because this is slightly smaller, I decided to fill in the base layer all in one go and then work on my individual layers following on from this. The base layer here, you can see I'm not putting one solid colour down. Just like with every single tutorial here, I'm paying really close attention to the reference photo and giving the base layers the time that they need to get them as accurate as I can at this stage. Now obviously they don't have to be completely accurate. We're going to be changing them quite a lot with each additional layer that we're adding. But I can already look back at my reference photo and see where the main set of highlights are and where the main sets of shadows are. I find for me, by breaking it down like this, I can work through a painting much faster and efficiently compared to if I was working with much larger areas. I find when I do work in larger areas, I spend more time staring at that reference photo than I do the artwork, and I'm sort of hesitating a lot more. So if you're finding that's something that is happening, break that reference photo and your painting down into smaller sections. Maybe work on the face first, then the neck, for instance the body, and then leave the branch till the very end. There is no real set order either, as long as you're using glassine under your hand like what I am here to make sure that the oils of your skin don't come into contact with the canvas. You can work in any order, any part of that painting that you wish. Just obviously make sure that the layer is completely dry before you lay the glassine over the top. And I'll just quickly mention before we go on to this second layer here, if you are interested in watching the much slower footage of this tutorial, the 2-hour version is available on my Patreon channel now, so I'll link that in the description below. I've also got a Patreon library on my website which I'll also link in the description, and that's got a list of all of my tutorials on both of my tiers so that you can see the type of content before you join up. Now the really good thing with Patreon as well, if you only want to join up just for one tutorial, you can cancel at any time. So it's a really nice platform to use. So as I say, all the information for that will be linked below. So for the second layer, you can see now how I was fighting with the transparent layers on the red part of the chest there. This is the one part of this painting that slowed it down because I really had to build up my opaque layers to try and get rid of that translucency. Now whether or not that's because this panel that I'm painting on here was a slightly smoother surface to a canvas, I'm not entirely sure, but I was able to get the finished look that I wanted. I did just have to keep on layering. Each additional layer that I was adding, I was slowly getting rid of those brush strokes that you can see there, and that is purely that way because the paint is so translucent, as I've said. The Liquitex Basics is a wonderful paint to work with, especially if you do like working in glazes, but I do find this to be one of the only downsides that I've found when using this paint. The oranges, yellows and reds can sometimes be more of that translucent colour, especially the yellows for sure. But if there's any part of your painting where you feel you've not got the desired outcome, just carry on layering. The really good thing with acrylics is as long as that layer underneath is dry, we can carry on layering until we've got the desired look that we're going for. All I had to keep doing here is just adding more intermittent layers of my white, hinting at the feather detail, glazing colour over the top and repeating the process. I found that by working that way, although it did slow it down as I've said, I was able to get that feather detail and also the colour saturation that I wanted. But sometimes we will come up with these little hurdles in our paintings. We just need to find a way of overcoming it. And as I say, because we can layer endlessly with acrylics, it's a lot easier to build up this depth and fix these kinds of, they're not really mistakes, but as I say, these kinds of hurdles. It's much easier than, say, colour pencil or graphite. Paper-based mediums like that, you're a lot more restricted given on how much tooth you've got left on that paper. Whereas something like this, just make sure that layer underneath is dry and reapply another layer. Also, something else that I had to do with this painting is the reference photo I got from this was from Pixabay. It's a really nice pose of this bird, that's why I chose it. But I could tell from the stick that it's perched on that there was new shoots coming on it. So this was obviously taken in the springtime. I wanted to make sure that I made this look wintry, so I made sure that I made more of my base layers more of that blue colour compared to my reference photo that contained more of the reds and the browns. So whenever you're changing the background of your artwork, you want to make sure that you do pull in some of those colours to the subject, regardless of what it is that you're painting, a pet portrait or a wildlife subject. We want to make sure that they both look in harmony. We don't want it to look like two separate photos. Now, whether or not you decide to incorporate, in this case, the blues right from the very beginning on your base layers, or you decide to add some blues as a glaze to final layers to pull in some of those colours into the bird, either would work. Just make sure it's something that you do throughout the process, or, as I say, those glazes at the end. If I was to have put the shoots on the branch as well, again, that's going to hint at a different season. I wanted to make sure that this branch only looked just like a bare branch. In winter there would be no green buds on it, there wouldn't be any fresh shoots. So I had to make sure that I was always considering those kinds of details right from the very beginning. It's very easy to just paint what we see. So sometimes when we're trying to incorporate or create a different feel for our artwork, it's very easy to just carry on painting what we can see in that reference photo rather than making those adjustments for our piece. So it is something that we should always be thinking about, and I do think the more that we paint and study and look at these reference photos, the more we train our eye to notice these kinds of differences. Now, throughout any tutorial, regardless if it's on Patreon or here on YouTube, I really do speak about the importance of my layers, my in-between subtle layers, before I go and add my details on top. This is regardless of the medium that I am working in. I think it is really important in creating more depth in our overall piece. If I was to have just done my very first base layer and then started adding these details on top, I would have nowhere near the same amount of depth within these feathers than what I'm achieving at the moment. And this is only the first layer of detail on the chest here. I've got so many more details, so many more highlights and refining my shadows throughout each of these additional layers that make this bird that much more realistic. If I was to have been putting these details in after my first base layer, everything would have been far more flatter, and that's obviously not what we want. I want this bird, the chest at the front with this highlight, to look like it's closer to the viewer, and for the tail to be pushed slightly further back. That's all going to be in the lighting. Make sure you get your highlights in the right place and the shadows in the right place. The contrast, I've said it already a couple of times already, is so important. If I didn't have the highlight that I'm working on here at the moment as bright as it needed to be, this chest area and the right-sided light source would have not been nowhere near as sharp. Therefore, the overall piece is not going to have the same impact. I really do want to make sure that I've got my lights and my darks as close as I possibly can. And although I say that I think contrast and your shadows, your highlights are more important than worrying about the exact colour, for this, obviously, I did want to make sure that I got that red-orange chest area as bright as it needed to be. That being said, I could have easily have had more yellow in my mixture and created more of that sort of yellow or orange mixture than what I've got here, and it still would have looked realistic. The photo might have necessarily been taken in a slightly different time of day, and that orange colour would have been different. I just wanted to make sure that I got that colour saturation and that vibrancy as bright as it needed to be, rather than worrying about the exact colour. Now for this, for the orange areas, I did add some magenta to try and get a little bit more of that redder colour, but that was only because I've got a bluer background. I wanted it to be more magenta based rather than those yellows. And these are all things that I think about at the beginning during the planning part of any portrait, whether or not I do need to add more of the warmer colours to my subject or the cooler colours depending on the background. It's something that I do take that extra time to make sure that I've got right. Now I do use a photo editing software as well, so I try and adjust the reference photo that I've got in my layout as close to the painting as I can so that I don't have to complicate the process anymore. If I can make it easier and speed up that process, then I'm all for that. If you're a beginner to any medium, looking at the reference photo, knowing that you have to adjust the colours in your painting can be quite hard to do that right from the beginning. So if you can adjust those colours, even if it's just by adjusting the hue, which most free apps will allow you to do, there's a couple of little tweaks that you can make to your reference photo to try and make it closer to what your artwork should look like. That's going to help your brain to see that a lot more clearly. So something to consider regardless of the medium that we're working in is the smaller that we're working, we have to be realistic with how much detail we can fit in that area. If I was to have been painting this bird on a much larger scale, I'm going to be able to add a lot more detail in the feathers. That being said, even though this is a fairly small painting, I'm still able to get a really good level of photorealism here, working with finer brushes, light pressure, and these multiple layers. I'm building up these layers gradually right from the very beginning. So when I am working smaller like this, I want to get the feel of the feather texture. I want to make sure that the viewer can tell that that's what it is, even though I'm not able to put in all of the feathers that I can see in that reference photo. Now, even if I was working larger, I wouldn't be trying to paint each individual feather in place. For me, I don't like doing that. That's for the hyperrealism, where you can't tell the difference between the artwork and the reference photo. For me, I don't like spending that long on a painting. I've got lots of respect for artists that do that, but for me, I would get bored far quicker. You need to spend so many hours, sometimes months, into one of these paintings just to get it up to that standard. Again, I've got loads of respect for artists that do that, but for me, it's just not my preference. So for photorealism, like what I want to go with here, I don't have to be painting in every individual feather. I just want to give the illusion of that texture. And when I get to about now on the painting, once I've done the feet and the detail, and this was one of the areas where it was tiny detail, I did just have to focus on the highlights and the shadows to replicate the shape of the toes here. But once I get to this part of the painting, it's here where I sort of step back from my easel and I look at what I think would make my artwork better. I'll usually then start to work with a couple of glazes just to reinforce some of my shadows, and I do that on this one right at the very end. and it's one of the biggest things that can help with our artwork. Once you think it's finished, put it aside for a day or two and then look at it again before you think that it's finished. Usually we then notice little things that we need to tweak when we have looked at that artwork with fresh eyes. Sometimes when we're spending hours, days, or sometimes weeks on one painting, it's really easy to almost get a bit blinded by what we see. Sometimes we don't notice any of these subtle changes that we might need to make that would make the painting better. So put it aside for a couple of days, as I've said, and then look at it again with fresh eyes before you class it as absolutely finished. Once you're then happy with it and there's nothing that you think you need to change, obviously once it's able to, you can varnish it, you can hang it, and you can do what you want with that. For this, my aim, I think I'm going to keep this for myself. I've made a little hole at the top and I think I'm just going to thread a ribbon on it and I'm going to hang it on my Christmas tree. I think because it is that smaller size, this would work really well for that, and that was my aim from the very beginning. Just to be sure, with any painting though that you do varnish it, I like to use a spray varnish, and that will just ensure that that acrylic painting is completely protected and it's therefore gonna last. So here is a photo of my finished painting. I really did enjoy working on this little robin here. So if you've got any questions, then pop them in the comments below. I'm more than happy to answer any. And if this video was of use, I'd really appreciate it if you could give it a thumbs up, because it does help. And if you'd like to get notified of future content, hit the subscribe and the bell button. And as mentioned in the middle of the video, if my slower tutorials are of interest on Patreon, I'll link that in the description below. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll be uploading another video very soon.